All right, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us this Friday for what promises to be an exciting discussion on organizational transformation during the pandemic. My name is Dan Fisher. I'm an executive board member at the Institute for Contemporary Leadership. And before we get started with today's panel, I want to share a few words about the Institute. We are an applied research learning center and innovation lab made up of thought leaders in the talent management and development space. Our mission is to enable executives to lead their organizations through the sort of disruption and volatility we've been experiencing over the last 14 months, and which our esteemed guests will reflect on today. You can learn more about the Institute at our website, contemporaryleadership.com, and please reach out to get involved. I'd also like to recognize the sponsors of today's webinar, CorpU and EnterMe, both of whom have been valuable partners to the Institute. CorpU is a leading e-learning provider that has designed cutting-edge technology to deliver engaging virtual executive education that translates to real-world impact. And EnterMe is a leading AI-based platform for organizational assessment and one of the premier providers of organizational network analysis, amongst other organizational surveys. And now I would like to hand it over to one of my fellow Institute board members, Dr. Steve Garcia. Steve is really the perfect moderator for today's panel discussion, given his deep expertise in adaptive enterprise operating models, much of which I'm sure we will hear from our esteemed panel on. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today. I want to start just by acknowledging that we find ourselves in an interesting and difficult moment. Here in the US, I think many of us feel like we're emerging from the pandemic, while in other parts of the world, most notably India, it's still really ravaging a lot of people. And we all have either ourselves or our friends or colleagues are still feeling the effects of it. And I don't think there's anyone anywhere who over the last 14 months hasn't had to change how they live and work due to the COVID-19. And that's really the focus of our discussion today, is how have we transformed ourselves and what can we learn from that and apply to what we do going forward. When we began organizing this webinar, we wanted to identify panelists who had really compelling stories to share about how their organizations had adapted in response to COVID. And I think we knocked the ball out of the park on that. They all have terrific examples, which I think you're going to find dramatic and exciting. At the same time, we don't want to just focus on the past. As Warren Buffett said in the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting last week, we don't know what the future will bring. Really strange things can happen. And so the second area of focus today is how can we take what we've learned and apply it going forward to build faster, more adaptive organizations that can deal with whatever comes our way. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, starting left to right, Jodi Rabinowitz is head of talent and organizational development at Zoom. I think we've all become very familiar with the Zoom platform. They've kept us connected over the course of the pandemic, and obviously it's what we're using here today during this session. We're also very lucky to have Mike Theilmann. Mike is EVP and CHRO of Albertsons, which is one of the nation's largest grocery and pharmacies. I myself shop at King's every Sunday morning, so I'm a big fan. We also have Steve Schloss. I've known Steve, I think, for over 12 years now. In his current role, he's Chief People Officer at the United States Golf Association. Their mission is to champion the game. They are the oversight body, both in North America and in the US and in Mexico. And they run 14 annual events, including the US Open and the US Women's Open. And then finally, last but not least, Tom Bigda-Peyton. I've been working closely with Tom over the last 12 months or so. Tom is the Chief Learning Officer at Catholic Health, a premier healthcare delivery system in the tri-state area. They have 18,000 employees and a network of 6 hospitals, nursing and rehabilitation centers. If we could drop the bios into the chat so everyone has an opportunity to see more biographical details about our panelists, that would be terrific. And then, of course, we also have all of you, our attendees. I want to thank you for participating today and encourage you to share your reflections, your feedback, your insights in the chat. One of the great things about the platform is our ability to sort of, communicate in a couple different ways. In addition to that, there's a separate on the bar, the app bar at the bottom. You'll see there's a separate button for Q&A. At the end of the session today, we're going to be opening it up and asking you to share questions for our panelists. 5 of you who share questions will be lucky enough to win a nice Yeti. So please contribute and share questions. We'll get to as many of those as we can. So with that said, I'd like to turn our first question over to Mike. One of the things that was really fascinating to me was that Albertsons, their run rate increased 250% after COVID. And that required, Mike, you to hire 50,000 employees in a matter of weeks. How did you do that? And what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, so thanks, Steve, for the question. I think, if I just set the background, we did not have a career website until January of 2020. We did not have a career website until that point. And we were on an older tech platform for hiring. We hired 65,000 people in about 3 months. And so we, by and large, did 2 things, and we tried to do 2 things really well. The first is I reached out to a bunch of CHROs that I know, and our talent team reached out to talent folks, and we knew we needed to hire people and other companies needed to furlough people, unfortunately. And so we kind of created a handshake partnership that said, we'll take care of your folks, right? At some point, you'll want them back. At some point, we'll probably be overstaffed given the peaks that we're hitting right now. And so wouldn't that be good for them, good for you, good for us? And so we had about 35 companies, Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt, American Airlines, Delta, the big ones that had steep declines, and mostly in the hospitality space. The second thing we did is we partnered with our vendor, Indeed. And working with them, we built some AI models that would help us with the hiring process in a much bigger, better way than we'd really ever done before, right? Normally, people would sit in the queue and somebody in a store would pull them down to look at their profile. They'd set up interviews. Sometimes they'd capture them, sometimes they wouldn't. And that process would take a couple of weeks at a minimum. And so we wanted to do it in a day. So they helped us build some great models. They also helped us find out the number of people we had just sitting in the queue, that were just sitting out there and hadn't been touched, which was a large number. We got about 1.5 million applications during this process.
Wow.
And so it allowed us to basically do that process upstream, do one scan of somebody effectively before they then would get to a store and get hired in a store. We would have people show up for hiring days on kind of Mondays and Wednesdays, so we could stage them. And it just gave us a velocity that we'd never even given thought to before. And our peaks were so big. Like we had days and weeks we were running, high double digit and low triple digit, increases, right? People were using toilet paper like it was going out of style for some reason. And luckily for America, that's slowed back down to some normal level. So I think the 2 partnerships with these 35 or so companies that a lot of them, I've known these folks for a long time, and others on our team have known them. And I think leaning into the technology side, and I think it was an eye-opener for us of what technology could do for us, not just in that instant, but as we take make our path forward.
I love the idea of building this. It's almost like a talent ecosystem, right? By drawing, it's a really neat concept. Jodi, I know that at Zoom you had similar hiring needs, and one of your jobs was to, get all the new Zoomies to understand what does it mean to work at Zoom, and it sounds like you did that in some pretty interesting ways. Can you share with us what the process is for getting all these remote workers sort of up to speed in the culture and the way you guys work?
funny, similar to Mike, so many of our new Zoomies lost their jobs as a result of COVID. And so here you are helping other people stay employed. So it was a really, they're very grateful. It was a very powerful experience for them. But Zoom literally has doubled in size, and half those people have never stepped foot into an office, where when we think of offices, that's sort of where culture is birthed. So our onboarding experience is very, very dipped in culture. So lots of speed dating with our breakout rooms, lots of videos of, certainly in the midst of this crisis, of sort of being in the war room at the World Health Organization, or you know, seeing videos of a first adoption. Like, a lot of first things happened via Zoom. And so our induction experience is really focused on head and heart, and then feet afterwards. Like, okay, head, heart, feet, now go do your job. And because we had have such a special culture, we've been extremely deliberate in guarding that and making it the first experience, so that you sort of really get a flavor and a sense of pride for being at Zoom. But it's really hard to absorb 200 new people a month virtually in the middle of a pandemic, while every single employee is, you know, subject to the same panic and anxiety than everybody else, right? Like, they too are homeschooling their kids, and they might have a spouse who's out of work, and they might have somebody who's sick, and yet they're still serving, you know, they're still serving the public. So,
and Jodi, what could you take from that and advise others to do? Like, if you had to, one lesson from the experience that you think might be applicable to others, what would that be?
well, there's one is, we're human beings. So whether you're a Zoomie or you're an Albertsons or a, you know, whatever you are, you're a human being. And so understanding that our employees also are, you know, feeling and thinking and experiencing what everybody else is. But number two is, you virtually need to be thoughtful, deliberate, vigilant, methodical around communicating and translating what culture means. It's harder to do it if you're not sitting, like, if you're not taking it in the snack room. So I think doubling down was, and everything we do. So I would say, you know, virtual, you know, not having that live experience means you have to be really, really thoughtful about making all of those touch points part of the culture.
Got it. Great. Thank you. So I know Steve, at USGA, you guys had just, if I remember correctly, you just finished your 3-year strategic planning process directly before COVID hit. And suddenly you had to completely revector what folks were working on, like redefine the goals, set up more sort of sprint-based approaches to things. Can you share with us, you know, what that looked like?
Sure. Yeah. And so what Steve is referencing is, we literally took a year to redesign what we thought were our priorities for the next 3 years. And we're planning an all-staff event in late January, mid-February. We had to postpone that till mid-March, and then you know what happened after that. And, you know, at the same time, as everyone knows, the world of sports was turned on its head, and we had to adapt in ways that were certainly unplanned for. And so what we decided to do was put a hold on our strategy, which theoretically, some of it had to happen no matter what through COVID. But we tend to be a very planful, long-term minded organization. We're 125 years old, even though we're operating in a 21st century context. And so one of the things that we did, we took a page out of one of the things that we do well, which is running national championships. And the US Open that Steve referenced, you know, that's an annual championship. It's coming up next month. We usually have 200,000+ people there over the course of a week, and it's a major revenue driver for us. And one of the things that you learn in running a national championship of scale is the ability and the need to be not just agile and resilient, but to really pivot in the moment and to reset some goals and targets, because each day, each hour brings issues and challenges in running a massive event at scale. And so we decided also to redefine that internally by asking people to put aside what they had officially signed up for 2020. And we began to reassess what are our priorities for 2020 as we believe we can deliver upon them, having made some critical strategic decisions to cancel events, reset timing of events, and so on, and also services that we deliver to our community. And we ended up creating a system by which we put every team into a place where we ask them, and individually, we ask people to think of their work in sprints, whether it was 7 days, 30 days, and 90-day sprints. And what we wanted people to understand was there are ways that you can contribute to our business success and have greater control over the environment that you're currently in, which is frankly out of control, so that you can feel like you're making a meaningful contribution. And we went through a process to get people embedded in that thinking, again, which is very much indicative of what happens every day in running a national championship, and ultimately give people the freedom and the tools to work with each other as a team and with your manager to make sure that you're constantly reassessing and reasserting what is possible and what is achievable. It also had a secondary effect that the way we look at our performance management platform is morphing towards more of a team-based, short-term ongoing process. While we are long-term minded, that let's recognize that the fluidity of the situation doesn't change going into 21. It's a new set of things that we have to be prepared for to be agile and resilient. So that's where we are right now. And as you can imagine, running large sporting events under the changing dynamics, even out of the news as of yesterday, continually puts us in a place where we're constantly responding to change and asking everyone in the organization to do the same thing.
And is that new performance management approach and the new sprint-based approach, is that something, Steve, that you guys are taking forward going forward? Will that change how you work on an ongoing basis?
Well, I think the main thing is, yes. I mean, we've essentially minimized the annual conversation, which is in itself not a new concept, but for us, we want to create much more freedom and connectivity to the work in a way where we can respond and give feedback and set goals in a more timely and rapid basis. And so it's given us the permission to operate in a way that I know we can, and we proved to ourselves last year that we can do it well.
That's great. And I know, Tom, you Catholic Health sort of went through a similar process in terms of, you know, really changing how you guys worked, and, you know, pushing decision making sort of to the front line in the midst of this. I'd love it if you could share that experience with everyone.
Sure. I think it's important to remember that in the first wave, this was an overwhelming traumatic event at every level, from individual to team to organizational, to everything was turned upside down and blown sideways. So this is the first time in the careers of our people that by going to work, they were risking their lives, that they were afraid of bringing it home with them, that they were living in isolation out of work, that they were treated as pariahs in the grocery store. That never happened before. So people had to respond to that sense of personal risk. It was chaotic. At first, it was both very confusing. Nobody knew how to treat this disease. You may remember that at first it's in China and we're reading about it, we're hearing about it. Then it comes to Italy, it's starting to get more intense. And then it's here in New York and it's a tidal wave, it's a tsunami, right? So that's overwhelming. So there were many different responses to that. But first was survival mode, get through it. You know, be as safe as you can while scrambling and amidst in confusion and lack of personal protective equipment, and who knows how lethal this is going to be. So people really answered the call. And in terms of what you just talked about, the basic assumptions had to turn upside down also. So this is a highly regulated, relatively structured, slow-moving industry. That had to change overnight. You had to take the assumptions that in order to get through this, we have to believe that no one knows. We have to trust in the staff. You have to leave your title at the door. You have to get more flexible. We don't have enough critical care nurses to take care of this overwhelming surge of critically ill patients. So we're going to have to take people from pediatrics who aren't trained in adult medicine. We're going to have to take people from respiratory, put them on the team. These people are having a hard time breathing. So it forced the issue of multidiscipline, of, listen, I don't care if you weren't trained for this, you're drafted, we're putting you at the bedside. So by crisis, and necessity was actually the mother of invention. People learned that they had to do very rapid trial and error. That was the only way to do it. They had to learn that we suspend the normal rules. We went from to some of the things that Mike was talking about. Our normal hiring process is fairly bureaucratic and slow, and now we can't wait. You got to get somebody hired in a week that used to take you, 8 weeks to do. And so, and you got to go fast. You can't go slow. This is a crisis, right? So, in the wake, we lost colleagues, we lost family members. These things happen, but people had to get through it. So, a couple examples of the quick response that I think you're describing. I'll just give a small one. So my team, I have a team of 8, we do corporate work, and our calendar was 80% called off overnight. So Jodi will be glad to know that I said to them on day 2, everything goes online now. We are a web-based shop now, as of today. And that took some learning and some unlearning and some relearning, but we learned in the process that small miracles could happen. As I was saying to her before we got live, we used to limit our workshops to 25 at a time because that's the space we had physically. Well, now we teach 50, 70, 150, and we make it work. And we didn't think that was possible. So we've done a lot of things as a healthcare system we did not think were possible. When the pandemic started, the way of treating it was, it seemed like it was a critical respiratory illness. So you put people on ventilators. Wow, that turned out not to work. Seemed to be the wrong thing to do. You found out by real-time experience. You started doing what we call proning, put them head down on the bed, because that turns out to be better. More people live that way. Many other innovations like that were spawned by necessity. So in the case of the hospital that you've learned about, we've talked about, the leadership at first was doing their normal command and control. Let's just dictate the guidelines for personal protective equipment. The reality, there wasn't enough. People were scrambling. They were wearing anything they could to protect themselves. So it was falling apart. Like the guidelines were not holding up. So then the chief nursing officer said, okay, what should we do? She gathered the team. They said, why don't we share the problem with the staff? And so they reoriented and they said to the staff, what's the minimum necessary equipment that you need to feel safe going into that room? Staff came up with the guidelines and it worked. So there were a number of things like that that I call self-organizing, a self-organizing system that happened by necessity. And our task since then has been to turn that crisis into a cause and bottle those elements and harvest them going forward. I can say more about that later.
Great, thank you, Tom.
I love that you said that, Tom, because we had a similar situation in, of course, it's painful in the moment when people are deployed to jobs and experiences they've never had before out of necessity. But we had a bunch of business development reps. All their job is to go fishing for new customers every day. Every day they go fishing, every day. And when the crisis hit, there was no fishing. It was just all jumping in, which was wonderful. But those people had to be deployed throughout the organization and do things like answer Zendesk tickets and learn things about our tool that they never had to know before. So again, silver lining, the opportunity in this crisis to be exposed to different parts of the organization and learn new things. So that really resonates for me.
Yep.
I know, Jodi, you talked about doubling down on culture, right? And Mike, there was a question that came through in the stealing one of our participants' questions, but that came through around how you created the culture you needed to go forward. And I think I remember you saying it was the first time that you guys had ever done a sort of, culture survey across the board. Would love to just hear about Albertsons' experience sort of leveraging culture as a means to navigate the disruption.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, culture and talent is by and large our agenda as a team and as a leadership team. I would say in culture, when I got here and our CEO got here kind of midsummer of 19, the culture of the company wasn't really defined, right? This is a company that was owned by private equity for 16 years. It was a roll up of assets, one after another. We've got 20 plus banners today. And so we were going about defining it. And we actually, we're getting to a definition that we felt good about as kind of the top 30 or 40 or 50 people in the company, and kind of we're pressure testing it. We were ready to go do a culture survey right when COVID hit, and we kind of paused. And we actually did the survey in kind of late May, early June of 2020. But obviously something hit in between those two timeframes, and that is George Floyd, right? And racial inequality and hate and discrimination. And we stepped back. The company had trained all 270,000 of our associates back in 2017 on unconscious bias. So I think the initial view was, let's go retrain everybody. And I wasn't for that. I just said pause. If we did it 3 years ago, why are we doing it again now? Because did it not stick? Like, what happened? So we took a pretty different tact, and this kind of percolated through our divisions, is where most of the ideation came from. And we created a kind of a more of a program, but it's really more of a listening program. We call it Leading with Inclusion, right? So it wasn't about diversity, but it was about inclusivity. And I think that's a core element of the culture we were trying to create, is inclusivity. So we did it through a series. We've now run about 150 sessions, close to 5,000 people have gone through it. And they're 2.5 hour sessions, no more than 30 people on a session. And we give them the opportunity, if they want to use a book that we've kind of leaned into called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And they're really listening in conversations. And I've been on these where there's been tears and emotions and people coming forward with their own view and how they were raised. And I'll share an example that I may have shared with you, Steve. We were on one of the first ones we did. We were probably an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours into it. And somebody called on a person. We were in our Denver division doing this. And this person said, yeah, I didn't read the book. And there, everybody said they were going to read the book. I was like, whoa, right? You got your division president and such on. You didn't read the book. He said, I found the book upstairs, and my 4 sons, age 17 to 13, had read the book, and they were talking about hate and discrimination and inclusivity, and we started talking about it as a family. And that's when it kind of hit me, like, this is what we need, right? This has been a problem in America for 400 plus years. We're not going to change it with some quick training in front of a video. That's just not going to happen. We need families to talk about it. We need colleagues to talk about it. And more than anything, we need people to listen to each other. And gone through these sessions, we took our whole senior management team through it. Like, the whole team went through it. And so we'll get through kind of all of the leaders in the company. So we'll have 7,500 leaders have gone through this by probably the end of the summer this year. And then on top of that, when things really came about, more recently with Asian hate, we started doing listening calls. And so we've probably had, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people on listening calls. And I think it's really important to just understand how people feel. Before you start talking to people, I think culture is more about listening than it is about talking. And really understanding that really helped us.
And Mike, I'm curious, those sound like really powerful, meaningful conversations. I'm assuming they were all done remotely. What was that experience like?
Yeah, our CEO was on all of them. Vivek has been on all of these sessions, and you can tell when people care. right? You can tell when leaders care. And, you know, he really cares. This is a big topic for us. We've brought in a lot of outside talent in the last year, very diverse, especially at the executive ranks. But I think really understanding how people are feeling, what's going on with their family. We literally don't talk about work or Albertsons or stores or e-commerce or just supply chain. We don't talk about any of that stuff on these calls. Never. That's not what we talk about. It's just people telling stories about, you know, I'm afraid to walk across the street. I tell my son that when he leaves the home and you're going out, never have your hands in your pockets. I mean, and for people to hear a mother saying that about their son who's African-American, just, you know, makes your skin just somewhere between cringe and twitch. And so I think people hearing perspectives from moms and dads and brothers and sisters instead of from store managers and district managers and senior executives, it's person to person, it's community to community, it's neighbor to neighbor. And I think that's the kind of culture, you know, we think of ourselves as a series of 2,300 neighborhood grocery stores, right? We're a community company. One of the first things we did when the pandemic hit is we said, we're going to give $50 million in cash to these communities for food. We give them a couple $100 million of food, just like our competitors do. That's great. But we figured out they also need cash because they have to be able to distribute the food. And so the community is such an element of our heritage, right? And these people are living in these communities and they happen to be on our team. They work for us. They're our associates and they're our partners. I think that was really fundamental as a stepping stone for our culture. And I think it's brought us closer together as a company. And we're at the bottom of the first inning on this, right? This is a long series of conversations and actions and things. But I think we feel good about kind of the first steps we've taken.
That's terrific. Thank you. One of the things I know you all talked about was the need to take care of employees who, this was really a mental health crisis as much as anything else. And Tom, one of the stories you told me was really, had an impact on me, and that was that there were, frontline workers who were in the hospital caring for patients, and they would go out in public and they'd be treated as pariahs because people were, in the early days, people were, thought that, they might become sick from these individuals. And so I was thinking about that, needing to sort of be on one minute and then treated, as a pariah the next is imagined to be quite taxing. What did you guys do to, maintain the resilience and mental health of employees through everything that happened?
I'd say we started by trying to listen carefully to what we were hearing from the front lines from the beginning. And starting in late May of last year, we started to form a project that has evolved organically that we call the Resilience Project. And it's actually gaining momentum now. It has been in the last several months. And our first mission, we had a system-wide task force that I pulled together. I call it an ad hoc advisory team. And it had representation from behavioral health, HR, my team, which is learning, nursing, pastoral care. We have a large pastoral care group or a Catholic organization. So the whole idea was, how do we get help to the caregivers, the frontline staff ASAP? And so our first move was to partner with an outside expert on disaster recovery in organizations. How do organizations recover from traumatic events like 9/11, Katrina, Sandy? It's awful things, school shootings. So he's been terrific. And we started with a half-an-hour workshop, because that's about what our staff can afford to pull them off the line, typically, on coping, self-care, and resilience. So we want to do that very quickly. So we ran that system-wide. In local units, we had members of our team. There was always some back and forth. Is it going to be entirely webinar? In the hiatus between Surge 1 and Surge 2, there was a limited ability for them because they were still going to the hospital. So we would have the training room as an option with a trusted advisor from our team there on the spot. And so we would give them that kind of inoculation, kind of individual strategies on how you care for yourself every day, some basic psychological education, and one thing you can do to lift yourself up. But we always knew that would be a team sport, and we knew we wanted to migrate into everyday resilience. clinical care is a tough job in intensive care and emergency departments. It's not not limited to pandemics. So from that, we migrated to doing debriefings with teams. We know from 9/11, I've studied it, colleagues of mine work with it, the after effects. If teams that were first responders did debriefing soon after the event, they had less PTSD downline. The military actually did that because they had part of their tradition. The police and fire did not. They studied it longitudinally, more PTSD in first responders for those who never had a chance to talk about it or get the toxicity out of their system, right? So that was our second move. We wanted to give staff, not a lot of interventions we did before were more top down, but a lot gets lost in the trickle down. We wanted to go direct to frontline staff and work backwards. So we did. And we had debriefings with a number of the teams in the hardest hit hospitals, including respiratory, nursing, team environment, that kind of thing. And now, most recently, in the transition to a quote new normal, which is not still so normal because a lot of these units have had no respite from COVID patients until maybe the last week or two for a year. So they're still suffering the after effects. And even if they're kind of marching forward, they haven't had a time to be able to process any of this. So we actually have been doing a series of short visits to nursing units, and we will visit them for 15 minutes at a time with the sponsorship of their director or their manager. And we help them process what they've been through and find their hope. Because the way we do debriefing is not just wallow in the misery. We listen to it, but then we say, oh, I'm so sorry you've suffered that way. How'd you cope? How'd you get through it? And that's when they'll start to say, you know, we had each other's backs. We answered the call. And then I'll say, I'll say, what are you proud of? What did you accomplish? They say, well, we did the work we were called to do. This is what nurses were meant to do. It's very moving.
Listening seems like it's a theme that's really emerging. You know, Jodi and Steve, I'm curious about your perspective on that. Was that common to your organizations as well? And how do you manage between the need to pause and listen versus the sense of urgency and the need to, do something right away?
You know, I would say for us, listening is a fundamental part of what we do since we are serving a community of 25 million people. And so at our core, as a mission-driven organization, we need to do a good job. We also probably spent more time in the last year listening to each other than maybe we ever had before. And if anything, the power of listening as a leadership skill was put on the front burner in a way that I think people probably under-leveraged and were unprepared to do in the way that we needed to do it over the last 15 months. So for us, you know, an example of engaging with people, we had call trees that we asked people to connect with people on a weekly basis and just to check in and listen. We asked people to listen to each other in ways that were meaningful, from what's the word that you feel today before we start this meeting to help us understand where you are in the moment, to helping understand as we're working out in the community that we serve, what are the needs of the community in a sport that ironically had a record year last year in the midst of all of this, and how do we ensure that we're serving our communities in ways that matter? So we've learned how to do it better internally. I think we're doing it better externally. I think ultimately, as a fundamental part of being a hybrid workplace, which is ultimately where we're headed, it'll probably become an even more critical skill set given the messiness of the workplace evolution. So.
Thank you. So what else do leaders need to do to promote that type of organization? Like what behaviors do they need to exhibit in this environment to be successful?
I mean, I think you got to get real. I mean, you just got to get real, because people are in real pain, and you have to be able to go there and be present. And it is about listening, and it's about listening and holding. there, whether everybody was more people were affected than others by the racial issues. Everybody was affected by COVID. Pain was in every crack. And, you have to just, it's hard. It's hard for, under the best of circumstances, to just be with someone's pain and hold it. And that's hard. But if you are a company that cares, if you're a company that ultimately cares about its employees, that ultimately serve your customers, you gotta just hold it.
That's really compelling, Jodi. Thank you for sharing that.
Steve,
Yeah,
I would just add to that, and I think Jodi touched on it there at the end. It's if you think about people, you get on a call, whether you're in person or you get on a Zoom and you say, how you doing? And somebody could say, my house just burned down, and you say, okay, let's get to business now, right? And so I think you really need leaders that truly care. Like, they really need to care. Like, there are so many people I know, both within our company and outside, that have just been through a lot, right? And a lot of it had to do with the pandemic. A lot of it had to do with racial hate. We had this deep freeze in Texas a couple of months ago.
mm-hmm.
People don't have their homes anymore, right? They've all their pipes burst. And so I think sometimes leaders don't want to act like they care, but do they really care about people? Do they care about people on the front line? Do they care about their teams? Do they care about the customers, our vendors? Just having a real in your heart, kind of pops through your skin, that you really care about others. And yet we can't solve all of people's problems, but knowing that they've got kind of a shoulder, they've got somebody they can call, somebody they can lean on, I think is just so critical. And I don't think that's going away. I think there's a lot of chaos going on, in the world. And I think it's only have been increasing, unfortunately. I think leaders that care are going to really differentiate themselves.
And so I agree with all of that. And we have a philosophy that leaders need to be in stewardship and in service towards something. And the question of what is the something is very important. So one of our answers in our attempt to bottle the spirit of self-organizing that I talked about earlier on the call is an initiative we call Employee-Driven Improvement, EDI. And Steve, you know about this, but essentially we're serious about that. What we want to get to is a place where employees are not just engaged or involved, they're actually driving improvement. And that's a different paradigm for us. The idea that, often we hear complaints that the employees are too reactive, too passive. We listen to them, but they don't give us suggestions. That has to change radically. And we think it can. And so that we're working on some very specific strategies to get that to happen. And I think you have to listen, you have to care, but you have to go beyond in terms of how do decisions get made. There's a principle of not only, I think, modern organizational learning, but also Catholic social teaching that says decisions should be made at the lowest possible level of the organization. If you take that seriously, it's very different than how we often operate. Why does the Catholic Church think that? Because each of us has unique God-given gifts, and the organization's job is to release those gifts. They are all unique. We need to tap into them. I can be to give a more secular view of that too. But that's where we're heading in terms of trying to bottle the spirit of engagement that happened during that first surge.
Thank you. One last question, and before we open it up and we pose questions from our attendees, and this question is to all of you, right? So what's the one thing that you would take away from this experience that you think would be guidance that you could share with your colleagues around how to deal with, black swan events in the future, large or small? And Steve, let's start with you.
Oh, okay. So I would say that living in the moment of March 9th, when I was given the task to help coordinate the effort as to moving our single biggest revenue driver and having no idea what I was doing, was the reality that what you know is less important than how you get things done through people and how you tap into the right people at the right moment to move something forward with clarity, with purpose. You will find yourself in moments like this where your expertise suddenly means less than how you move something forward with all the right people around you.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go next?
So when we were in the middle of the crisis, we're still in the middle of the crisis, but super front of the crisis, we did this work with intact teams, and we made them stop for an hour and sort of like a psychoeducational, how are you doing? What are your silver linings? What are you learning? And what are you learning about your leader? What are you learning about each other? And the leader said to this team, I knew you were right when I hired you, when I interviewed you. And it goes back to what Steve is saying. It's fundamentally about good people, the right people from a values perspective. And it just get it done. So being really thoughtful about that.
Thank you, Jodi.
Steve, I would say for me, thinking about your question, it would be to shine a light on the moments of opportunity and creativity in the darkness. And they will be there, but we often tend to overlook them. In healthcare, we are based on an emergency department model of responding to crisis constantly, all the time. It's called problem fix. What's the problem? I got to fix it. That's the doctor's job in an emergency department. The whole organization of modern healthcare was built around that. So you're looking for gap, you're looking for negative, you're looking for problem. And what we found, I think, in harvesting the lessons learned, even from the first phase, was that the moments of innovation were there throughout, but you could miss them if you didn't look for them, if you didn't pull them out. One of the things I like to use as an example is the teaching we do on resilience is based on research that shows in response to a major crisis like a pandemic or a hurricane, about 20% of people will have stress injury, which can lead to PTSD if not treated, but that's 20%. About 60% will bounce back to normal because we're built to be resilient. We're made that way. We've adapted that way over eons. And about 20% will experience post-traumatic growth. This is captured in the colloquial phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There actually turns out to be truth to that. After the World Trade Center, people that I know and have learned about actually went through kind of an existential crisis. I can't go back to the city. I can't do that again. Well, maybe I can't go back to the life that I had before. And they build a new life. And it, in the long run, turns out to be better. Teams can do that. Organizations can do that. But we don't pay attention enough to that. So that would be the thing I would want to highlight.
Thanks, Tom. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I would say I learned a lot about being more vulnerable. When the pandemic hit, our CEO kind of turned to me and a couple others, and the next thing I know, I'm talking to doctors. I'm talking to epidemiologists. I'm talking, like, I took science in college, but I was a math and physics, not a biology and chemistry. And I'm talking to these doctors and I'm writing things down and I can't spell anything. I don't even know what the hell they're talking about. And, you know, I kind of stepped forward and said, hey, there's got to be one person out of 300,000 that knows way more about this. There's probably 299,999 that know more about this than me. And so I think being vulnerable, we went and got a medical advisory board, right, with people that knew what they were talking about. And we used those people to guide us as opposed to me listening to people to try to figure out how we're going to guide us. And I think it was a good lesson, probably a 50th time in my career I've had this lesson, is just be vulnerable and be open to saying, I don't know, I'm not the right person for this, and go get the best people. And the best people for us on this topic were outside the company. And I think that's okay. You want the best people helping you solve the problems, whether it's a pandemic or it's something else. You want the best people in the room, whether it's your team or a broader team. Just get the best people and be vulnerable that you don't have the answer.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. What we want to do now is last chance to enter questions into the Q&A box. Dan will be pulling some of those out to share with our panelists. And maybe while folks are doing that, We haven't talked as much about sort of mid-market PE. If Jan's on the line, I'd love to get his, 60-second perspective. I know that he's done, Jan is CEO of Venture and has done a whole slew of organizational health assessments over the course of the pandemic. So maybe Jan, you've got just a point of view you could share with everyone on what you're seeing from a mid-market PE standpoint. And I think I see your face, but I think you're on mute. Now I see your face and you're not on mute, but I don't hear you.
Perfect. Steve, can you hear me?
I hear you now. Yes, now go for it.
Very good. So I think some of the topics that have been touched on across the large companies very much resonate in the mid-market as well. And so the burnout issues, the mental health challenges, people were thrown at the beginning of the crisis into the mode of how do we react? And it was very much about where everybody shifted to remote ways of working. How do we connect back? How do we bring the teams together? And what's essentially happened now is the burnout that has been caused by working remotely. It's something that's pervasive across all the different organizations. And it's been about creating level of cohesion in the companies. And I think what Mike has mentioned about becoming vulnerable, it's something that leaders had to step forward and make very real because nobody had the clear answers. And so that shift that happened quickly has translated into how do we bring people in to better lead, get the feedback from the organizations, get the answers, and then empower people deeper in the business to essentially drive and lead the change. And I think now what's happening is that as the companies have adapted to the dramatic change at the beginning of COVID, it's thinking about now we have options about how do we adapt in the ways of working going forward. So with the hybrid work, where a lot of people are thinking, do I stay working remotely? Do we adapt and bring people back to the office? So now there is an option where the people have tasted the opportunity of working remotely, and leaders are really trying to evaluate, do we ask people to come back to the office? Do we create a level of a hybrid opportunity? Do we essentially create a level of culture that can work going forward? And what is the right model? And so all of these questions are essentially on top of leaders' mind. And it's very unclear because at the beginning of pandemic, it was a rapid change that happened almost overnight. Now there is an option of how do we come back? And there is a lot of uncertainty because preferences are different. And essentially leaders are thinking about what is the right option that we want to take because now there is a choice.
Yeah.
And so unlike what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, where everybody had to deal with the event almost immediately. And so that's where now we are in a position where people are thinking, how do we adapt our culture? How do we empower people to kind of self-organize in the organization where there are different circumstances, different preferences, and you no longer have that level of pressure that existed at the beginning of the crisis.
Choice makes things harder. There's no question. That's interesting. Thank you. So Dan, can you pose some questions to the panelists from the ones that have come in from our attendees?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Steve. And I just want to note that, we've done a lot of these webinars, and frankly, I think we've had better questions than we've had in the past. So it's extremely hard for me to choose. So if your question is not selected, it's not because it wasn't an excellent question. I'm going to go with Gina Crawley asked, she called out Steve and Tom on this. You talked about being agile, which is another change in a company culture where layers of approval happen to accomplish sometimes are required for a simple task. What are you doing moving forward to keep the agility as a mainstay in your company so your people can respond quickly?
Steve, it's to both of us. You going to go first or should I? What do you want to do?
Sure. The interesting thing is we had actually put 3 cohorts of leaders through what we'll define as agility and resilience cohort-based learning 3 years before this actually happened. Never in our wildest dreams did we think it would be applied in a pandemic. And so how did we continue to embed that into our culture through those three cohorts? But I would say, how do we keep it going forward? I think as we move towards more of a team performance operating model and operating in a hybrid workspace, and on top of that, going back to our full suite of, for example, service-based operations in our 14 national championships, we are going to look for people to take probably greater independent decision-making and risk management in the field than they might have taken on in the past. Because we need them to think in a more nimble way than they were probably prepared for 15 months ago. And so we're going to pay close attention to people's ability to navigate their own risk profile, but also how to, in the moment, out in the field, be more capable of managing the uncertainties that we're all operating in while running safe events. And I think that's going to be a test for us. But the goal is to get people more comfortable to operate in that space.
Hey, thanks, Steve.
So,
Tom, maybe 30 seconds or less,
yeah.
just so we can get another question in.
Yeah, I would just say, historically, I would have said you create system change and transformations through top down, bottom up, middle out. We have flipped that. We're going bottom up, top down, middle out, or bottom up, middle out, top down. And we have this couple of programs we're doing, employee-driven improvement. We have a program we do with Steve and Dan called Leading in a VUCA World, Volatile, Uncertain, Complex, Ambiguous. We have a coaching program that supports EDI rather than being top-down. And we're doing resilience, D&I, and clinician well-being. All that's in the mix.
Thank you, Tom. Dan, we've got probably time for one more question.
Okay, what we're going to do here is Evelyn Rodstein asked a great question, which people have touched on before, which is how has this experience evolved you as business leaders? But let's just ask our panelists to come up with 1 to 3 words to describe their change over over the pandemic during this transformation. And starting with Jodi.
This has been the coolest professional experience I've ever had in my life, and it will never happen again. And it's, again, silver lining. A lot of work, a lot of pain, pure joy. It's like an OD candy store.
Mike, how about you?
Caring and velocity. You just really care about people and move with velocity. We're going to get some things wrong, but we can fix them later.
Great. Steve?
Enjoy the outdoors.
I love it.
Perfect. And Tom?
I would say make yourself vulnerable, and small miracles will happen all the time.
Terrific. Okay, so maybe now if we could just put our final slide up. So everyone, just what's coming up next? We've got a new white paper that I think we're going to throw in the chat. So it's yours. That the 7 leadership development experiences you should try right now. Right, this is stuff that we've seen at ICL work really well in a VUCA world. So some different things to try, and then we're launching our Contemporary Leadership Awards. Nominations are accepted as of June 14th, and so think about which leaders you think have done an exceptional job navigating disruption, and please share, nominate them for the award. We'd love to recognize them for their contribution. And who wins the Yeti? Great question. So we had 35 folks, looks like, in our Q&A. We've got 5 Yetis, so you can do the math, but we've got your email, we'll contact you, and we will get your shipping instructions and get those off to you. So thank you all for participating. Really enjoyed it. Thank you in particular to our panelists for all of the insight and wisdom. Olivia, thank you for supporting, and we hope to see you all again soon.